The studio lights glared, bright enough to bleach the edges of the air. The pastel backdrop of the view shimmered faintly, a cheerful mask for the current beneath. Donald Glover walked in from stage right, his step deliberate, his frame lean, but waited as though every movement was calculated not for performance, but for precision. The applause rolled in waves, some genuine, some polite, all curious. From behind the cameras, producers leaned forward, knowing the segment had potential to combust. This was not going to be a soft interview. Joy Behar sat center, her red framed, glasses catching the light. She smiled warm for the audience, sharp for her guest. In her decades on air, she'd learned how to wield humor like a knife, and today the blade gleamed. She waited until Glover had settled into the curve of the couch before leaning in, voice deceptively casual. "So, Donald," she began, the corners of her mouth tugging upward, "you've been making headlines lately, telling folks some pretty strong things about what? Voting rights? Police reform?" She let the words dangle like bait. "I've got to say, you do have a knack for glamorizing chaos." Glover's gaze didn't flinch. He tilted his head, one brow lifting, the hint of a smile touching his lips without reaching his eyes. "Let's be precise," he said evenly. The air thickened. Joy's smile stiffened just enough for the camera to catch it. "That's not what I meant. Let me explain." Glover continued, his voice calm but coiled with urgency. Somewhere off stage, a floor manager's headset crackled. The director mouthed, "Hold the shot," and then, like a match cut, the feed went to commercial. Glover sat frozen in the chair, jaw tight, the murmur of the audience faint under the thump of studio music. When he finally moved, it was only to lean back, eyes distant. The stage was set. The applause faded into the hollow clink of coffee mugs and shifting chairs. Donald Glover sat forward now, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely, but ready like a man waiting for his turn at the stand. The commercial break was a thin veil, barely enough to mask the tension simmering beneath. Crew members moved around them with quiet efficiency, but eyes darted to the couch, knowing the next exchange could be the clip that looped on news cycles for days. When the cameras blinked back to life, Joy's voice was already in motion, smooth as glass. "Donald, you've always had this dual thing going on. You're a comedian, a musician, an actor. People adore your art. But lately, you've been stepping into the political arena with both feet. And frankly, some folks are wondering if you're mixing the two a little too much." Glover's expression didn't shift, but his silence lingered long enough to make the studio audience restless. He finally spoke, each word deliberate. "I've never seen them as separate. The art is the truth, and the truth is political." Joy leaned back, folding her arms. "Sure, but when you call out voter suppression or talk about systemic bias, it's not the same as writing a song. People hear it differently. You know that, right?" He held her gaze. "I hope they do." The audience gave a low, uncertain murmur. This wasn't the playful banter the View was known for. It was something sharper, heavier. Joy tilted her head, searching for an opening, but Glover's calm was immovable. A flicker passed between them, mutual recognition that they were no longer debating for ratings. They were on the fault line of something bigger. By the time the third segment began, the conversation had shifted from polite sparring to something closer to cross-examination. The studio's warm lighting suddenly felt clinical, like an interrogation room where every flicker of expression could be evidence. Joy adjusted her glasses, leaning forward as if to close the gap between them. "Look, I'm not against you, speaking your truth. But when you say things like, America doesn't want to see its own reflection, people take that as a rejection of the whole system. You're a public figure. Donald, you know how this works. Those words carry weight." Glover's voice remained steady, but there was an edge now, a careful steel. They should carry weight, otherwise they're just noise. And we've had enough noise. The audience shifted uneasily, unsure whether to applaud or hold their breath. Joy countered quickly. But isn't there a risk in painting with such? A broad brush? I've lived through civil rights marches, wars, political assassinations. You think people back then didn't want change? We fought for it. A faint smile ghosted across Glover's lips, more weary than amused. And yet, we're still fighting for the same things, aren't we? The sentence hung in the air like a gavel strike. Somewhere in the control booth, a producer whispered to another, "This isn't daytime TV anymore." On screen, though, nothing broke the tableau. Joy, rooted in decades of public discourse. Glover, the disruptor, refusing to let history's wounds be smoothed over for comfort. For the first time that morning, Joy's eyes narrowed not in humor, but in defense. The battle lines were drawn. The studio felt smaller now, the space between guest and host charged like the air before a storm. Donald Glover shifted in his seat, the fabric of his jacket pulling, taut across his shoulders. His eyes didn't wander, not to the cameras, not to the audience, but stayed locked on Joy Behar. He spoke more quietly now, but the softness carried a weight that demanded the room lean in. I didn't come here to be combative. I came here because I know this show reaches people I might never speak to otherwise. Joy's posture straightened, the faint trace of a smirk curling at the edge of her lips. Then maybe you should. Try meeting them where they are, instead of hitting them over the head. He inhaled slowly, like he was holding back 100 responses. Meeting them where they are has been the excuse for standing still. I'm not here to stay still. 4. The first time, Joy's expression wavered. There was something personal in his words, something that seemed to hit a mark she didn't expect. She leaned back, crossing her legs, and her voice dropped lower too. You think I don't understand? I've had my share of being ignored, dismissed, laughed off the stage. Comedy was my way of fighting back. The audience quieted. The edge of competition between them softened just enough to reveal the undercurrent. Two people shaped by very different tools, but cut from the same cloth of resistance. Glover's gaze lowered for a moment, and when it rose again, there was no smile. And sometimes the fight isn't about laughing through it. Sometimes it's about refusing to let anyone laugh it off. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause, not by the fifth segment. The studio wasn't just an interview space, it was an arena. The hum of air conditioning was drowned out by the pulse of anticipation. Every audience member leaning forward, sensing something irreversible in the air. Donald Glover sat back now, one arm resting on the chair's edge, the other hand loosely, gripping the microphone. His stillness was its own kind of defiance. He knew how television worked, how every gesture could be clipped, replayed, reframed. And still, he didn't shrink from it. Joy Behar cleared her throat, her tone rapt, in casualness that didn't quite mask the strain. People are watching this right now, thinking, why is he so intense? Why can't he just lighten up? She gestured toward the cameras, as if the viewers at home were right there in the room with them. Glover's eyes narrowed slightly. Because people are dying while we lighten up. Because silence is comfort for the comfortable. And I'm not interested in that. A ripple went through the crowd. Some clapped, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Joy leaned forward, elbows on the desk, a hint of challenge in her smile. So you came here to make people uncomfortable? I came here to make them think, he said, the words firm but without malice. If that makes them uncomfortable, maybe they needed to be. In the control booth, a producer mouthed too. The director were off the rails now. But it wasn't chaos, it was clarity, raw and unscripted, unfolding in real time. The audience's eyes darted between the two, knowing they were witnessing something that wouldn't be neatly wrapped. But by the end of the hour, the studio air felt heavier now, as though oxygen itself had slowed. The co-hosts sat in a quiet semicircle, their earlier chatter muted, eyes flicking between Joy and Donald, like jurors watching counsel go head dash to dash head dot. Joy leaned forward, her voice tightening, the friendly cadence now replaced with something more pointed. Donald, some people would say you're justifying unrest. You've spoken about protest movements, about the anger that spills over. Do you condone that? Glover didn't move at first. His gaze stayed fixed on her, the silence stretching into something almost unbearable. When he finally spoke, his words were low but cut like glass. I don't condone violence, but I don't criminalize the pain that leads to it. The audience murmured, a sound like wind rustling through dry leaves. Joy's chin lifted slightly, as though bracing for impact. But there's a line, isn't there? You can't just excuse chaos because it comes from pain. He sat back, one hand resting on his knee, the other gesturing subtly as he answered. I'm not excusing it. I'm explaining it. And if we can't talk about why people are breaking, then we've already decided their lives are worth less than our comfort. The camera caught the smallest flicker in Joy's expression, not defeat, but a recognition she wasn't going to corner him. Around them, the bright set felt transformed. It wasn't midday television anymore. It was a hearing, a deposition of the public conscience, each word recorded and archived in the minds of millions watching. Somewhere in the back row, a woman folded her arms tightly, her jaw clenched not in disapproval, but in the uneasy realization that she agreed with him. The exchange wasn't over. It was just getting sharper. The air between them seemed to tighten. But this time, it wasn't just about the heat of the moment. It was about what each had carried into the room long before the cameras rolled. Donald Glover's voice slowed, softened, though it never lost its edge. I remember standing in a crowd once, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, chanting until my throat went raw. We were loud enough to shake windows, but the world still looked at us like noise. You start to realize the sound isn't for them. It's to remind yourself you're still here. Joy's eyes narrowed slightly, not in skepticism, but in focus. Her own voice dropped lower. I remember my first set after 9/11s. The air was heavy in the city. Nobody knew whether it was okay to laugh. But I knew if I didn't make people laugh that night, they'd sink deeper into fear. I wasn't saving the world. I was keeping people from falling apart. The audience had gone still, caught in the yaw. Strange intimacy that had replaced the verbal sparring. Glover leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze unflinching. Laughter has its place, but sometimes the moment needs grief, needs anger, needs truth so heavy it can't be turned into a punchline. Joy sat back, eyes flickering with something unreadable. For a long beat, the two didn't speak. There, shared silence more telling than any retort. Behind the cameras, a producer mouthed, "This is gold," but in the room, no one thought about ratings. The exchange had shifted from public performance to something private, two different survival tools, laid bare for the other to see dot by the time the segment reached its midpoint. The conversation was no longer contained within the studio walls. The moment was bleeding into timelines, text threads, and news feeds before it had even finished unfolding dot in the control booth. A digital ticker scrolled with live social media reactions. He's speaking truth to power. Joy's losing her grip. Why is he so angry? Each new comment was a gust of wind, fanning the flames already burning on set. Donald Glover adjusted his seat, crossing one leg over the other with a deliberate slowness. He glanced toward the audience, not at any one person, but at the space where the studio ended and the millions at home began. People are watching this thinking about which side to take, he said, his voice carrying a measured calm. But this isn't about sides. It's about whether we want to look at what's real. Joy's smile had thinned, more guarded now. And you think the only way to do that is to strip away every comfort? If comfort keeps you blind, he replied, then yes. The audience's reaction split down the middle, applause from some, stiff silence from others. In living rooms across the country, phones lit up. Cable networks began prepping lower third headlines. Donald Glover sparks fiery debate on The View. Clips were being clipped, reframed, and uploaded before the show even reached its next commercial break. Back on set, Joy glanced toward the co-hosts. But they remained silent, sensing the gravitational pull between her and Glover was too strong to interrupt. The conversation had become more than a segment. It was a battleground with no clear exit. The air felt thick now, as if every breath in the studio had to be pulled through tension. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their slow pans lingering longer than usual, catching every micro-expression. Donald Glover's voice had lost none of its steadiness, but there was a heaviness in his tone, now a fatigue, not from this single exchange, but from the accumulation of years. You can't keep asking people to be patient, he said quietly. You can't keep telling them to wait for the right time, the right place, the right tone. There's never going to be a time that feels right to the people who don't want it to happen. Joy shifted in her seat, her hands clasped together, fingers laced so tightly her knuckles whitened. She exhaled, the sound barely caught by her mic. You're not going to change the world in one morning talk show segment. No, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. But I can refuse to pretend. The audience was silent now. Not the silence of disinterest, but the silence of a room bracing for something they knew was coming. Joy's lips parted, as if to continue, but Glover was already rising from his seat. He straightened his jacket, the soft scrape of his shoes, against the stage floor loud in the hush. I need to go, he said, almost under his breath, though the mics caught every word. For a split second, Joy's expression softened, just enough to betray surprise, maybe even regret. But he was already turning, walking past the edge of the set, beyond the reach of the cameras. Somewhere in the audience, a chair creaked as someone shifted, eyes following him until he disappeared from view. The segment wasn't over, but the conversation was. The studio applause sign blinked red, but no one clapped. Donald Glover's departure had pulled the air right out of the room. The co-hosts sat frozen in their chairs, Joy staring at the spot where he'd been just seconds ago, in the control booth. Voices overlapped, directors, producers, stage managers trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or hold the wide shot. On the monitors, Glover's retreating figure was already half in shadow, the bright set behind him fading into the dim backstage corridor. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and hot cables, the distant hum of studio machinery mixing, with muffled applause from another soundstage. His steps were steady, not hurried, but there was an unmistakable finality in them. Behind him, a voice called out soft, almost hesitant. Donald. He stopped, but didn't turn right away. Joy Behar stood at the threshold, framed by the rectangle of stage light spilling into the dark corridor. She wasn't smiling now. Her glasses caught a dull reflection from the overhead bulbs, her expression unreadable. You didn't have to walk out, she said. He turned, meeting her gaze with the same calm he'd carried on stage. I didn't come here to give sound bites. I came here for a conversation. If that's not possible, then walking out is the only honest thing left. She exhaled through her nose, a small shake of the head. You think this is going to make things better? He didn't answer right away. Better? No. But maybe it'll make people see that comfort isn't the same as resolution. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he turned again, the shadows swallowing him as the door at the end of the hall swung shut behind him. Back on set, Joy walked back to her seat, the crew counting down at her earpiece. She forced a half-smile for the camera, but her eyes stayed. On that empty space across from her dot, the segment's replay hit the internet before the show even ended. Clips of Donald Glover's walkout were spliced with hashtags, each one framing the moment to fit a narrative. Speaking truth, overreacting, the View Showdown. Cable News picked it up within the hour. One network played the exchange under a scrolling Chiron Donald Glover leaves mid-interview, while another ran it alongside archived footage of his past speeches and performances. The split-screen effect turned a quiet exit into a cultural Rorschach test. Later that afternoon, Glover posted a short message. No lengthy defense, no fiery rant. Just a sentence. If the table won't hold the truth, I'd rather stand. Bye. Evening, Joy Behar addressed the moment briefly on air. She didn't offer a full apology, nor did she escalate. I think sometimes, she said, we get so caught up in proving our point that we forget to listen. I'm guilty of that too. The audience applauded politely, but the comment lingered, heavier than she intended. In coffee shops, offices, and group chats, people replayed the footage, pausing on facial expressions, dissecting the pauses between sentences. Some saw a principled stand. Others saw needless drama. But no one dismissed it as just another talk show spat. A week later, a college student stood up during a campus panel on media and activism. She cited the moment without naming either party, saying, "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to keep playing along." In that way, the confrontation lived on, not as a feud, but as a question. How much truth can we bear before we call it chaos? And though the cameras had long since cut, the silence after his exit still echoed, a reminder that comfort and justice have never shared the same seat. Weeks later, the incident still pulsed through the media bloodstream, not with the blinding speed of a viral flare-up, but with the slow burn of something unresolved. Podcasts dissected it. Editorials drew lines in the sand. The View's ratings spiked briefly, then settled into a quiet hum. But that one episode remained their most replayed segment of the season. Donald Glover moved on, or appeared to. Interviews for his new project steered carefully around the moment, but the subtext hung in the air. His laugh in these conversations was easy, but his eyes sometimes lingered just a second too long before answering a question about public discourse or art in the political arena. Joy Behar kept her rhythm too. The next week, she pivoted, from politics to celebrity gossip with practiced ease. Yet, in a rare off-camera moment caught by a phone, she was seen sitting alone at the show's empty table during a commercial break, staring at her notes. Lips pressed tight, as if replaying a conversation she wished had gone differently. The world, however, had already assigned them their roles: truth-teller, provocateur, celebrity, critic. But life is rarely that clean. Glover's quiet exit and Behar's sharp words remained suspended in the public imagination, stripped of easy moral binaries. Somewhere in that ambiguity, the power of the moment took root not as a victory or defeat, but as a mirror. For those who watched, it was less about choosing sides and more about confronting their own threshold for discomfort. And perhaps that was the real legacy of that day, not the clash itself, but the truth it left behind, untamed and unanswered, waiting for the next table brave enough to hold it. Months had passed. The headlines had moved on, feeding on fresher outrage, newer controversies. But somewhere in the vast archive of daytime television, that episode sat like a small fracture in the set's polished surface. Clips of Donald Glover's walk-off resurfaced every few weeks on TikTok, in Twitter threads, as a reference point. In debates about celebrity responsibility and media gatekeeping. Each repost carried its own framing. Some painted him as a man unwilling to be cornered, others as a guest too fragile for the arena. But the truth, as always, was less about fragility and more about boundaries, about knowing when a conversation is no longer a conversation. In an interview with a late-night host, Glover finally touched on it without naming names. "You don't owe every part of yourself to every room," he said, smiling slightly, as if the lesson had cost him something. The crowd laughed, but the moment landed like a quiet sermon. Joy Behar, in her own book released that year, devoted a single paragraph to the incident. It was wry, almost dismissive. "Donald Glover's a talented guy. I hope he comes back sometime. Maybe next time we'll talk about the weather." But between the lines, there was the faint outline of respect earned, not by agreement, but by the willingness to walk away. And so the clash became part of a larger story, not just about a talk show segment gone wrong, but about the invisible line between public stage and private self. A line both of them, in their own way, defended that day. In the end, the cameras had stopped rolling, but the scene never truly ended. There are moments in media history that live far longer than their runtime 2 minutes of footage that carry the weight of years. Donald Glover's departure from The View became one of them, not because it was the loudest, but because it was, in the end, uncomfortably human. In the weeks that followed, podcasts dissected it with forensic zeal. Cultural critics compared it to past on-air walk-offs, Whoopi's own infamous exits, Bill O'Reilly's stormouts, but noted the distinct difference here. Glover hadn't erupted. He'd simply refused to be rushed, refused to have his words chewed into sound bites, refused to let the heat of television override the cool of his own convictions. For Joy Behar, the incident became another notch in her long ledger of public collisions, a reminder that she, too, had built a career on unfiltered speech, and that, sometimes, the very sharpness that drew viewers could push guests away, and for the audience, both in studio and across millions of screens, it was an unplanned lesson in the anatomy of a breaking point. They had witnessed what happens when two skilled communicators refuse to yield, not out of spite, but out of fidelity to their own truths. Months later, the network quietly re-released the full, uncut segment on its streaming service. No commentary, no edits, just the raw footage. The silence is intact. And for those who watched it in full, something remarkable happened. The clash seemed less like an explosion and more like a strange duo of two voices that could never harmonize, but could never quite cancel each other out. It was over. And yet, it wasn't.